And now, LB Deyo will talk about the Trojan War.
Thank you, Mickey Delp. How y'all feeling out there? Mythological. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm just going to say this before I start. Strange cultures, ancient beliefs, heroes, and monsters. This is mythology. And this is the Song of Troy. Now, I don't think I'm giving anything away here. I think you know how this one ends. The Trojans wake up one morning, and what do they find outside of their insuperable gates but a giant wooden horse? Yes, and there's a little bit of controversy. Do we trust Greeks bearing gifts? Do we not? And Cassandra, Priam's daughter, Priam being the king of Troy, begs them not to let this wooden horse into the city because she says this is an obvious ploy by the Greeks. But they say, look, the Greeks have departed. Their ships have sailed away. Give me a break. This is a legitimate offering by the Greeks. Come on. So they open wide the gates of Troy. And they celebrate. And they get drunk. And there is great merriment and pleasure inside of Troy, because after all, they've been fighting these Greeks for 10 long years. And so, we have it from Aeneas, or from Virgil and the Aeneid, what happens next. But all the while, the skies keep wheeling off, and night comes sweeping in from the ocean storm in mammoth shadows swallowing up the earth, and the pole star and the treachery of the Greeks. Dead quiet, the Trojans slept on, strewn throughout their fortress, weary bodies embraced by slumber. But the Greek armada was underway now, crossing over from Tenedos, ships in battle formation under the moon's quiet light, their secret ally. Homing in on the berths they know by heart. When the king's flagship sends up a signal flare, the cue for Sinon, saved by the fate's unjust decree, and stealthily loosing the pine bolts of the horse, he unleashes the Greeks shut up inside the womb. The horse stands open wide. Fighters in high spirits, pouring out of the timbered cavern into the fresh air. The chiefs, Thesandrius, Sesthenius, ruthless Ulysses, rappelling down a rope dropped from its side, and Acamasthous, Neoptolemus, son of Achilles, Captain Machaon, Menelaus, Epus himself, the man who built that masterpiece of fraud. They steal on a city buried in sleep and wine. They butcher the guards, fling wide the gates, and hug the cohorts poised to combine forces, plot complete. Yes, and of course, scarcely a Trojan survives the night. The Greeks rush in, burn the city to the ground, slaughter all the men, and steal all the women and children to make slaves of them. And this is the happy tale, a tale of love and fate. You see, the story of the Trojan War, the most famous story ever told and the most famous war ever told of, though it probably never happened, the story is a fractal of sorts because it has a great broad panoramic story, but if you drill down to any point in this story, you will find it almost infinite levels of detail buried within. And again, as you drill down further into each aspect of the story, you see the same themes: the love and the fate, the irresistible fate, the fate of men and gods alike. Because even the gods are absolutely helpless in the face of prophecy and fate. And of course, it starts with Helen. Helen, born to Leda and Zeus, though her human father is Tyndareus. She's born when Leda is turned into a swan, so she's born as an egg. Incidentally, she has a sister, Clytemnestra, who of course will become the wife of Agamemnon, and she has two brothers, Castor and Pollux, known mainly as constellations today. The Greeks, when they behold Helen, of course, are besotted. She is, without a doubt, the most beautiful and desirable woman on the face of the earth. And so, foretelling disaster, Tyndareus gathers them together, and Ulysses says, I've got an idea. By Ulysses, I mean Odysseus, that's his Greek name. Odysseus, the wisest of all the Greek kings. He says, we've got to make a pact. Do you ever wonder why the Greeks all went off to war just because one of the kings had his wife stolen? Well, this is the reason. They made an oath, the oath of Tyndareus. They all swore to fight to protect the marriage of whomever Helen chose. So Helen chooses the red-haired king of Sparta, Menelaus, and travels back with him to Greece. Meanwhile, the story of the Trojan War dates back even to the beginnings of time, because Thetis, one of the earliest gods, the goddess of water, helps Zeus in his hour of need as he battles Kronos, and is rewarded somehow. Now, Zeus and Poseidon both agree that Thetis is the most beautiful of the goddesses, and they both decide that they want to marry her. But there's a prophecy about her also, that her son will be greater than his father. So Zeus and Poseidon are not necessarily willing to have a son who is greater than they are. So they say, let's have her marry a great Greek king, the king of the Myrmidons. That's Peleus. And they throw a great wedding in honor of this happy couple. And Zeus, of course, invites everyone, doesn't he? All the gods are welcome, all the goddesses. No, well, not all of them. Eris, the goddess of discord. Who the hell wants her at a party? She's going to ruin everything. Well, that's exactly what she does. She crashes the party and tosses an apple of gold into the party, and on it is written, to the fairest. And she splits without explaining who the fairest is. Well, Athena, Hera, and Aphrodite, each is convinced that she is the rightful owner of this apple. And they ask Zeus, Zeus, will you please choose which of us is the most beautiful so that that person can go off with the apple? Well, Zeus says, hell no, I'm not choosing. I'm not stupid. How do you think I got to be king of the gods? But he recalls a story of a young prince who is now disguised as a shepherd and living in the forests of Asia Minor, a man named Paris, who is renowned for his honesty and judgment. He says, this man will choose. Meanwhile, Thetis gives birth to the son of herself and Peleus. He is triple fated. There are 3 prophecies about Achilles. First is that he will choose between 2 paths, one of an ordinary but long life, and the other a short but glorious one. The second prophecy is that he will be vulnerable only to his heel, because when Thetis dips him in the water, she holds him by his heel, and only the water flows over his whole body except for his heel. I'll tell you about the third prophecy later. Now, the goddesses go down, and they find Paris in a grove on Mount Ida, and they say, Paris, guess what? You are going to choose who among us is the most beautiful. Now, if you think about it, this is a very, very rotten thing to do to young Paris. He is just a guy, the son of Priam, a prince of Troy to be sure, but nevertheless just a man. He's not even capable of looking at the goddesses in their actual form to judge them, because as we've established in other myths of the Greeks, the goddesses, to behold a god in his or her natural form is to die instantly. How is he to judge? So, the goddesses are prepared for this eventuality, and they offer him bribes. Athena offers him unmatched strength in war if he'll choose her. Hera offers him rulership of Europe and Asia. But Aphrodite, who has seen into Paris's heart, knows what he really wants, and he offers her the marriage to the most beautiful woman in the world, Helen of Troy. Not yet known as Helen of Troy, of course, but she will be. Now, Paris goes on a diplomatic mission on behalf of Troy to his trading partner, Menelaus of Sparta. Ostensibly, they're there to make some kind of a deal. In fact, Paris is there to take Helen back to Troy. Does he abduct her against her will? Does she fall in love with him and voluntarily go with him? The experts disagree. But in any case, she is gone to Troy with Paris. So, according to the myth, the oath of Tyndareus, the Greeks must now all go to Troy to fight on Menelaus's behalf, including, well, the gods even take sides in this conflict. We have Zeus, who is for all and for none, unwilling to take sides except briefly at different times taking both sides. We have Ares, Aphrodite, and Apollo fighting and rooting for the Trojans. And we have Hera and Athena for the Greeks. Priam lives in his walled city, walls built by the gods themselves, incidentally, and he is there as king of Troy with his wife Hecuba and his sons, Hector, the greatest, firstborn of his sons, the greatest hero of the Trojans, Paris, of course, Aeneas, who will become very important later, and the surrounding kingdoms of Asia Minor, the Lycians, the Amazons, and the other Dardanelles. So, the Greeks travel to Troy. Who are they? Agamemnon is the leader of the Greek, brother of Menelaus, and a husband to Helen's sister, Clytemnestra. Menelaus, the wronged husband, of course, Achilles, and Patroclus. Achilles, the greatest of the Greek fighters. Patroclus, his buddy. Odysseus of Ithaca. Diomedes, the king of Argos, and in many ways the most important of the Greek fighters up until the end. Ajax the Great and the lesser Ajax. Nestor, who was one of the Argonauts. So, they're preparing to depart by ship to Asia Minor, but the winds die down. Someone has killed one of Artemis's sacred deer, and she is punishing them by stilling the wind so the ships can't make any progress. It turns out Agamemnon, the leader of all the Greeks, must sacrifice his own daughter, Iphigenia, on an altar in order for the Greeks to be able to travel. He does this, and his wife Clytemnestra takes note and says, "You have slain our daughter, you son of a bitch." They travel to Asia Minor by ship, a journey of a few hours, I believe, and they land in the wrong place. They land in Mycenae, and they spend years fighting their way to Troy, fighting past all the other allies, in which progress they destroy many cities, take many slaves, and many concubines against their will. So there are 9 years of blood, 9 years of brutal fighting, horrifying fighting. And then at the 10th year, we have the Iliad, the Homeric epic based on the Trojan War, which of course really only covers a few weeks toward the very end of the Trojan War, but not all the way to the end, because it doesn't include the Trojan horse. Anyway, the story of the Iliad is the story of the rage of Achilles. Achilles begins the story arguing with Menelaus. Why? Because Menelaus has a concubine named Chryseis, whose father is a priest of Apollo. The priest of Apollo, who is a Trojan, comes and says, please let me ransom my daughter away from you and let her go free. Agamemnon refuses. Apollo attacks the Greeks with his arrows of plague and makes them very, very sick and very vulnerable. The Greeks impress upon Agamemnon that he must release the daughter. And finally he does. He's prevailed upon to do so, but only when great damage has been done to the Greek forces, so they're in jeopardy. Now, Agamemnon says, hey, if I can't have my concubine, my slave, then I am not going to let anyone else have his, or particularly Achilles, the so-called greatest of the Greek warriors. Well, Achilles is furious. He says, you can't take away Briseis, my concubine. I won't have it, and if you do, I'm not going to fight anymore. Well, that's exactly what happens. Achilles storms back to his tent, and Hector storms out of the city of Troy and beats the Greeks back all the way to their ships. He even gets on board one of their ships and sets fire to it. Their ambition is to burn all of the Greek ships and trap them there on that beach. Well, Patroclus goes to Achilles and says, listen, this is really not going to work. Achilles, our fellow Greeks are being slaughtered by the Trojans on the beach. You cannot let this happen. Achilles says, the hell I can't, because when he took away my concubine, Agamemnon took away my glory. He took away my fame, which is what I'm here fighting for after all. So, Patroclus says, hey, give me your armor, I'll pretend to be you, and I'll go fight. Well, Achilles says, sure. Gives him this beautiful armor, this fine armor, and Patroclus goes out, and it does appear to be Achilles returned to the fight. And the Trojans are terrified. They can't believe it. And they see him coming, and he has his apotheosis, his great moment of glory. He beats back the Trojans away from the ships, all the way back to the walls of Troy. He slays many and many a Trojan hero, until at last he meets Hector. Hector, the firstborn son of Priam, who slays Patroclus. Well, I don't think I've mentioned just how serious a matter Achilles really is, but he is a bad motherfucker. And so now it's on. And I mean it's on. Achilles doesn't like it when people kill his buddy Patroclus, and ends his bromance with him in such a violent way. So as Homer puts it in the Iliad, with that, Achilles pulled his bronze spear from the river bluff and left him there. The Trojan's life slashed out, sprawled in the sand, drenched by the black tide. Eels and fish, the corpse's frenzied attendants, ripping into him, nibbling kidney fat away. But Achilles went for the Paeonians, helmets plumed, still running in panic along the river's rapids. Once they saw their finest fall in the onslaught, beaten down by Peleus' hands and hacking sword. He killed in a blur of kills. Thersichilus, Mydon, Astypius, Menesus, Thrasus, Aeneas, Ophelestes, and still more Paeonian men than the runner would have killed if the swirling river had not risen, crying out in fury. Taking a man's shape, its voice breaking out of a whirlpool. Stop, Achilles, greater than any man on earth, greater than in outrage too, for the gods themselves are always at your side. But if Zeus allows you to kill off all the Trojans, drive them out of my depths at least, I ask you, out on the plain, and do your butchery there. All my lovely rapids are crammed with corpses now, no channel in sight to sweep my currents out to sacred sea. I'm choked with corpses, and still you slaughter more. You blot out more. Leave me alone. Have done, captain of armies. I am filled with horror. And the breakneck runner only paused to answer, so be it, Scamander, sprung of Zeus, as you command. But I won't stop killing these overweening Trojans, not till I've packed them in their walls and tested Hector, strength against strength. He kills me, or I kill him. And so he does. He faces down Hector and slays him. Hector, before he dies, has but one request of mighty Achilles, that Achilles respect his body, that he not mess with his body, that he leave his body intact for the family to give it a decent burial. Well, Achilles doesn't roll like that. Achilles thinks, oh, very, very much to the contrary. I am going to chain your body to my chariot, and for 12 days he drags the body of Hector around the fabled walls of Troy. And on the 12th day only, Priam himself sneaks out of Troy to the Greek camp, and he begs Achilles face to face to please relent and let Priam take his son Hector back for burial. And Achilles sees the tears of this old man, and he at last relents. And then Achilles dies. He goes out onto the field of honor, the field of Scamander, and he is himself shot by who? By Paris. And where is he hit? Well, of course, in the heel, and with a poisoned dart, no less, and with an arrow guided by Apollo himself. Achilles dies. Paris is almost immediately afterwards himself killed. And then the horse. The Greeks, exhausted, feel that they have made no progress in 10 long years. They're constantly threatening to mutiny and leave. And then Odysseus himself, wisest of all the Greeks, proposes the horse. And of course, as we know, the horse works. The Trojans are slaughtered almost to a man. Aeneas, among all the sons of Priam, escapes in the night, though he leaves his wife behind, and she is killed. Priam is killed by Pyrrhus. Hecuba is taken as a slave, as are many of the Trojan women, including Priam's daughter Cassandra, the prophet, who is taken by Agamemnon himself, and the Greeks depart. Agamemnon gets home with Cassandra in tow, and he finds that Clytemnestra, despite her forgiving nature, not only is having an affair with Aegisthus, but is still rather miffed at Agamemnon for slaying and sacrificing their daughter Iphigenia, and she murders both Agamemnon, mightiest of the Greeks, and Cassandra, his unwilling consort. Odysseus also departs, but he will face his own punishment, as it will take him 10 years to make what should have taken only a day or two to sail back, because he is continually abducted by beautiful goddesses. And these goddesses hold him prisoner in their flawless beds of love. He has some other adventures too, persecuted by Poseidon. Most of his men, in fact, all of his men are killed, but at last he makes it home and massacres all the young men who have been courting his beautiful wife, Penelope. And what about Aeneas? Well, in an epic poem written by Virgil about 1,000 years after the Odyssey and the Iliad were written, Aeneas goes to Carthage. He relates to Queen Dido the story of his loss and the fall of Troy. Then he goes to Italy, where he fights the Latins, conquers them with his Trojans, and long after he dies, his ancestors, Romulus and Remus, found Rome. And in fact, not only is the Aeneid the story of how the Roman Empire was founded by Trojans, but it is also the story of how another of Aeneas's descendants, Augustus Caesar, came to be the most great man in the world. And then there's Helen. Incredibly enough, Menelaus and Helen, who have been at the center of all of this strife and horror, who indeed have been the cause of so much strife and horror, are themselves living happily ever after in Sparta. And Odysseus goes to visit them, and they tell him all about how good their lives are and how all is forgiven between them. And that's that.
Wow. Thank you. That was amazing. Whew. All right. Who has the first question for LB? Yes. Hang on. Got to put you on the microphone so that you're going out on the stream.
Were there any characters in the Aeneid, the Iliad, or the Odyssey that weren't just completely awful?
Were there any characters who were not completely awful in any of these epics? The answer, I think, is yes, and the chief among those are Hector and his family, his wife, and his infant son, who incidentally the great hero Odysseus throws off of the walls of Troy during the massacre. Hector is really a model of everything that a hero should be, and was in fact used during the Middle Ages as a example of a model of chivalry, because he is brave and powerful, but he is also restrained and kind.
Great. All right. Next question. There we go.
What do you think of the Victorian author and scholar Samuel Butler's theory that the Odyssey was written by a young Sicilian girl and not whomever Homer was or wasn't?
What do I think of Samuel Butler's theory that the Odyssey and the Iliad were written by a young Sicilian girl and not by Homer? I think it's an outrageous theory. I've never heard it before in my life, and I find it absolutely absurd. But it is, though I'm revealing my ignorance about Samuel Butler's theory, I do take this as an opportunity to point out some interesting facts about the authorship of the Iliad. The fact is, Homer, the author of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is himself a mythic figure. There is no evidence that particularly that he ever lived. The Iliad and the Odyssey show enormous evidence and proof of having been composed orally across many, many generations in an illiterate society during the Greek Dark Ages when no one could read and write. And the greatness of the poem is often attributed, or these poems, is often attributed to the fact that they arose out of this oral tradition and were constantly refined in telling and retelling. Bards would actually speak to great personages and recite the Iliad or the Odyssey in their entirety over the course of several days. And anything that wasn't really good just got weeded out. Like the bards couldn't even remember something if it wasn't good enough. You also see the things like the use of epithets, like Achilles, the swift runner, or Odysseus, the raider of cities. We see these epithets appearing, and they're kind of mnemonic devices that actually help the bards to remember their poetry.
Okay, somebody here. Okay.
So, other than, I guess, for a metaphor about like a weakness to a warrior, why don't you think Achilles was dunked twice?
Say again.
So, why don't you think Achilles was dunked twice?
Yeah. What's this about dunking? What?
Achilles, famously dunked into the river by his mother, Thetis of the glistening feet, which made him mostly invulnerable. Why not dunk him a second time by a different part of his body so that his whole body would be invulnerable? Well, I'm going to make a confession for you here. I realize we're talking about stuff that isn't actually real, but I'm one of these people who does not even believe that Achilles was invulnerable or believe anything about the heel of Achilles. It's not in Homer. It's never mentioned in the epics. And Achilles is wearing armor. There's no mention of his being invulnerable whatsoever. Nothing to suggest that that is the case. And I think that is just a separate myth that got tacked on later on.
Oh, we got lots of questions.
Hey, LB, I have it. This is sort of a two-parter because there were two things that you mentioned that I didn't hear you come back to, which was why did you say that Diomedes was one of the most important of the Greeks? And what was the third prophecy? You got two of the three, but then you said, "Oh, I'll come back to the third one," and then I'm not sure what the third one was.
I'm glad you asked about the third prophecy of Achilles, because I can't remember what the hell it was. So I'm going to pass over that. Diomedes, though, is this a fantastic king who is really, because of Achilles and his petulance and because of the vicissitudes of the way the war went, Diomedes probably killed more Trojans than anyone. He was an incredibly brave and brilliant fighter, also quite a good man like Hector, and he's also distinguished among all the characters in all of Greek mythology. He's the only person, the only human who ever wounded a god. He wounds both Aphrodite and Ares in the course of a battle. He is that bad. He just refuses to be intimidated by them, and he slashes them with he slashes the hand of Aphrodite, and then when Ares comes down to protest, he shoves a spear into Ares' guts and spills his ichor over the ground. Of course, it doesn't really do them any harm, but my God, it's stirring.
One more question.
So I want to ask about Achilles and Patroclus. I think everyone kind of laughed about the kind of going over that, but I'd like to hear why you left out the theories about them and kind of what your theory is on their relationship.
Achilles and Patroclus. Well, well, well. Honestly, I'm just going to tell you my opinion. I do not think that Achilles and Patroclus were sexually involved with each other. I'll tell you why. Because, again, it does not appear in Homer at all. There's absolutely nothing in the Iliad to suggest that they were lovers. And I would also point out that it's not as though the Greeks were uncomfortable with this sort of thing. They talk about homosexual relationships all the time. They're mentioned in the Iliad. So if Homer had believed that these two were lovers, he would have just said so, but he doesn't. So on the other hand, many people disagree with me, and so I thought it was worth sort of insinuating something, and that's what I did.
I know I saw another hand. We can do one more question. Somebody in here? No? Somebody's changed their mind. All right. That is plenty. And thank you, LB, so much. Fantastic.